I know that you mentioned the VOLGA trial. Would one of you want to maybe elaborate a little bit more about what that was?
Yeah, so the VOLGA study is a study also in patients with muscle-invasive urothelial cancer who are also cisplatin ineligible. And it randomizes patients into 3 arms. So the standard of care arm is just observation followed by radical cystectomy. And then the other 2 arms are in combination with immune checkpoint inhibitors and enfortumab vedotin. There's an arm with durvalumab, tremelimumab, and enfortumab vedotin, and the other arm is durvalumab and enfortumab vedotin. Again, compared against just observation followed by radical cystectomy. In both of the experimental arms, patients, of course, also get radical cystectomy and then get some adjuvant treatment as well. So yeah, it's I think will be a very, very important study. I think, again, we have to see the data, but given that it's really comparing against a current very, how should I say, maybe insufficient standard of care, which is just, radical cystectomy. I think it's very high likelihood that this, we'll see a positive trial. I don't know.
I think VOLGA trial is very exciting. I think you summarized it greatly, Vadim. So you have, the EV and antibody drug conjugate against Nectin-4 plus checkpoint inhibition, durvalumab in this case, and the PD-L1 plus minus tremelimumab, so 3 arms, which is a huge trial to do, a 3-arm design in the neoadjuvant setting. We'll talk about Niagara in a second, but I think the VOLGA trial with 3 arms is really, really, I would say, optimistic, ambitious, but I hope they will accrue. It's an important trial, and I think, as Vadim pointed out, we have so much enthusiasm with enfortumab vedotin plus checkpoint inhibition. So, and that trial is in cisplatin ineligible patients. So the control arm is not getting any neoadjuvant therapy. So I think this trial is very promising. Of course, we have to make sure it accrues and reports results. We saw some early data by Dr. Drakaki at ESMO looking at ctDNA in a very early subset, small number of patients, looking at ctDNA reduction or clearance in some of those patients with neoadjuvant treatment. Of course, it's early days, but I'm glad to see some attempts to evaluate biomarkers, especially circulating tumor DNA, in that and other trials. So it was, again, nothing practice changing, but an early signal that we can measure, we can detect the DNA in the neoadjuvant setting, and we can evaluate the clearance. And of course, with longer follow-up, we can try to evaluate, the investigators will evaluate the potential association of that ctDNA clearance with long-term outcomes.
Right, no, absolutely. And we're gonna talk more about ctDNA in a second, but I think, the biggest practice-changing GU result maybe actually across tumor types. I'm not as familiar as what has occurred in other tumor types at ESMO, but we can't go on without talking about Niagara. So I would love to hear your thoughts on this study that we just heard about 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, you can start.
Well, sure. I can lead off, and then I'll pass it off to the discussant at the conference.
So re-give the discussion.
Yeah. Yeah. So I will maybe take a step back and say, again, in this setting, so muscle-invasive bladder cancer, and these are now patients who are cisplatin eligible, we've actually had, over the past several years, a number of these trials enroll patients that have sort of a similar design, so a combination of chemotherapy and an immune checkpoint inhibitor compared to current standard of care, which is chemotherapy, cisplatin-based specifically. This is followed by radical cystectomy, and then in the experimental arm, patients still receive some adjuvant checkpoint inhibitor, whereas in the control arm, the standard of care is then at that point observation. Although I should say now, for high-risk patients at the time of surgery, nivolumab is also available, and that's an important point in actually evaluating trials like this as well. So as I mentioned, we have a number of these trials. There is a keynote study with pembrolizumab, I believe it's keynote 866. With pembrolizumab chemotherapy versus chemotherapy for cisplatin-eligible patients. There is the ENERGIZE study with nivolumab and cisplatin-based chemo versus cisplatin-based chemo. But the one, of course, we're going to talk about today is the one that read out first, and read out, importantly, of course, with a positive and practice-changing, I would argue, result. And so Niagara was a study combining durvalumab with cisplatin and gemcitabine, followed by radical cystectomy, followed by adjuvant durvalumab, in comparison to current standard of care, again, which is cisplatin-based chemotherapy followed by radical cystectomy. The trial met its, essentially all its endpoints, event-free survival, importantly overall survival. Hazard ratio for the overall survival was, I believe, 0.75, so relatively robust hazard ratio, and really showing a real clinical benefit of this combination. I think based on this, it will become the standard of care. That's what I anticipate. Of course, we have, again, a number of these other studies that will also be reading out, and so it'd be, I think, interesting to see how those trials measure up as well. One other trial I'll mention is actually, again, with enfortumab vedotin, an Nectin-4 targeting ADC. So that's EV-304, or Keynote B15, and that's a combination of enfortumab vedotin and pembrolizumab, followed by radical cystectomy, followed by adjuvant enfortumab vedotin and pembrolizumab, relative to, again, cisplatin-based chemotherapy. So we're eagerly awaiting, of course, the results of all these studies, but we have the results of Niagara. Again, I would argue it is practice changing, and I think going forward at least, that's, and once it receives regulatory approval, I think this will be the new standard of care. Some questions do remain, and I'm sure you'll address this, such as, do all patients need this adjuvant component of treatment? And I mean, I think that's something we can have a real discussion about.
You summarized it greatly, Vadim. What a great time. I agree with you, Karine. I am biased, but I think Niagara was probably one of the most important, even not most important, I would say, data set that we saw at ESMO in the entire meeting. And if you think about it, we had back-to-back, 2023, 2024, 2 and 2-4 GU trials in the presidential symposium, just showing how much energy, and how much effort is being done, how much progress is made in the field, which is great for our patients and, of course, overall the field moving forward. The Niagara trial, very interesting effort, more than 1,000 patient trial. That's a huge effort, and this included the time of the pandemic. It finished accrual, actually it was July 2021. So part of the trial was during the pandemic, and kudos to the investigators that they got it through. More than 1,000 patients, neoadjuvant, GEM-Cs in the control arm with no adjuvant therapy component, as Vadim pointed out. Neoadjuvant GEM-Cs for cycles was there. In the experimental arm was the addition of durvalumab, 4 doses neoadjuvantly and up to 8 monthly doses adjuvantly. So the addition of anti-PD-L1 to chemotherapy neoadjuvantly, then the adjuvant component. The design of the trial was reasonable. This was about 6 or 7 years ago that it was designed, but of course, by definition, cannot help us tease apart the contribution of the neoadjuvant component, adjuvant component, or we need both. But for now, I agree with you, we'll take the trial result as it is, and I will probably take the sandwich approach, a perioperative approach that has some merits theoretically as well. So as Vadim pointed out, pathological complete response rate was higher with the addition of durvalumab, 37% versus 27% in the GEM-Cs alone group. You may argue this sounds lower than expected. There might be some hand-waving reasons, hypotheses. Maybe there was about 6% of patients in each arm that declined cystectomy for no progression or toxicity, and these were counted in the denominator. So we'll a little bit lower, rate because of that. The other question is, back in the day, Vadim, you and me published a study looking at split dose cisplatin. And we had a small cohort, if I remember, was about 30 patients with GFR below 60. You were the first author. And what we saw that with GFR below 60, some patients may tolerate split dose cisplatin, of course, small numbers. So we do not know the impact of split dose cisplatin prospectively. And there were about 20% of patients, I think, if I remember correctly, in the Niagara trial that had GFR below 60 and they got split dose cisplatin. Could that impact path CR rate or not? Nobody knows. It may not, but just we don't know. And then, of course, the pathology review is also another factor that influenced path CR. In any case, there was a 10% delta in path CR. And as Vadim mentioned, there was significant improvement in event-free survival, hazard ratio 0.68, and overall survival. That, to me, that was very surprising to see that, hazard ratio 0.75. I think key points, of course, the completion of the trial happened before the approval by regulatory agencies of adjuvant nivolumab. So the control group did not have, most of those patients, if probably all, did not have access to adjuvant nivolumab at the time. And of course, whatever they may or not have received in metastatic disease, that can impact overall survival too, if someone has a recurrence. So these are the inherent limitations, caveats. Having said that, I agree with Vadim, positive trial. We cannot ignore EFS and OS benefit. In my opinion, I agree with you, it's practice changing. The question will be regulatory review. In my mind, of course, many more questions are, come. There is a challenge with checkpoint inhibitor later on, if the patient has a recurrence or not. What about dose dense and VAC? I prefer to use that in fit patients in my practice. And there is some early hints that checkpoint inhibition plus dose dense and VAC may be a compelling strategy. We don't have phase 3 data yet. We have seen data from the AURA trial that look at dose dense and VAC plus avelumab, gemcis plus avelumab neoadjuvantly, smaller phase 2 trial, numerically, not powered to compare, numerically, dose dense and VAC plus avelumab had higher path CR rates as opposed to gemcis with avelumab. And we're working actually on an investigator-initiated trial at our center, and we're going to report the data in the near future, looking at dose dense and VAC plus pembrolizumab, and we'll look at subtype histology. So we'll see the future about dose dense and VAC plus IO, but for the moment, I think Niagara trial, I think, is positive and practice changing.
Yeah, I think it's really exciting, and I think it's institutional dependent, who chooses to give dose dense MVAC. Perhaps based on this data, some people will choose to move to more gemcis durva instead of dose dense MVAC with these results.